Hello ladies and gentlemen of YouTube. Today I wanted to have a short video discussion about the visual debacle, or rather the discussion around the graphics of Pokemon Sword and Shield. I want to mostly focus on the graphics found in the game, as you can see currently in the gameplay that is on your screen. Not so much about the animations. I would like to use this video to address some of the discussions around the low quality assets found in this game, as well as some of the arguments being thrown around. I have seen people complain that Sword and Shield is a game that could not possibly look any better on the Nintendo Switch, and as far as I'm concerned, that is blatantly untrue. However, on the opposite side of things, even though Sword and Shield should be able to look much better on the Nintendo Switch, I also believe that perhaps we should have seen this quality of visuals coming well before the actual demos were starting to show. And that will be something that I'll go into near the end of the video. For the purpose of my argument that this game should be able to look much better on the Nintendo Switch, I want to compare Pokemon Sword and Shield to two other fairly similar games, collectible games. I would like to compare Pokemon to Persona as well as Ni no Kuni. I believe both of these games give a good idea of what you can do with visuals to be more pleasing to the eye, to be more up to date with the visuals, etc. And because they are also games in which you collect the whether it be Persona or the Familiar, they are basically still just Pokemon. For those reasons, I chose those two games. Before we get into the comparisons, I guess I should give a little bit of background on my personal experience with Pokemon. I am not a huge Pokemon fan, like some of the dedicated YouTube channels, but I do have a fair amount of experience with the Pokemon games. Starting off with Pokemon Gold on the Game Boy Color back when that was still new. Then I worked my way backwards to Pokemon Blue, and after that I actually took a fairly large break before coming back to the Pokemon franchise with Omega Ruby, then into Ultra Moon. And I still have Soul Silver and Pokemon Y as well. That kind of gives a good idea that I do play Pokemon fairly regularly. I really enjoy Pokemon. I think the games are nice. I never found them particularly innovative when it comes to the visuals, not since Pokemon Gold anyway. I do think that they've made some major steps, some major improvements from the 6th generation onwards when they went 3D. I also believe that Pokemon was never all that visually spectacular. You've been seeing Pokemon Sword and Shield in the background here for a good while now. I believe it's already very clear by the gameplay you're seeing, as well as the discussions that have been going on. Honestly, the Wildlands, even though it is a really good concept, looks rather barren when it comes to the graphics. We'll bring up Zelda Breath of the Wild quite a lot. I would like to do that later. I believe that the way that Zelda is set up fundamentally is very different from Pokemon. This world is meant to be much more interactable. There are very few NPCs inhabiting the world of Breath of the Wild. It's quite different if you don't have to worry about rendering gaming characters on your screen. Rather, it's just smaller groups of foes who are quite spread out throughout the world. Pokemon didn't really ever aspire to do that. Background here, you're seeing footage from Persona 5. What I would like to emphasize, oh, by the way, this is the Persona 5, the Royal Edition footage. It's not the original Persona 5. I don't think it really matters because visually they are identical. It's more so an expansion than a hugely improved sequel. Now let's get into the kind of the workload argument that's been following Pokemon Sword and Shield. leaks have started to come out since about yesterday, where the Pokédex is about 405-ish Pokémons. And I believe, although I don't entirely know how the new Pokédex expands or works, I believe there is still an expanded Pokédex from imported Pokemon that are still supported by the Galar region Pokédex. But let's assume that it is about 405 Pokemon that are native to Pokemon Sword and Shield, which you will be able to catch inside of the game, give or take the ones that are version exclusive to Pokemon Sword and version exclusive to Pokemon Shield. That's more than any Persona game. That's more than Ni no Kuni for later. But I believe it is very important to cover the amount of reused assets. Even though Pokemon has a lot more Pokemons inside of it, and even though the developer Game Freak has argued that a lot of models have been updated, gameplay footage which have already been extensively analyzed by people has shown that not all models have been remodeled. In fact, quite a lot of them are imported, and I am actually quite okay with that. I am for that. But I don't think that that means that they couldn't look better. Like I said, I mostly want to dispel the argument that Pokemon Sword and Shield can't look better, because frankly it can. Persona 5 has about 207 Persona, which is a lot less as compared to Sword and Shield, obviously, but compared to its predecessor, Persona 4 and Persona 4 Golden, everything pretty much has been rebuilt from scratch in Persona 5. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if some animations have been reused. That's only quite logical, especially for recurring attacks. But if you look at the actual character models, their idle animations, the shading used, the amount of polygons making up the character models, all of that has been pretty much rebuilt from the ground up, as far as I can see anyway. Which means that it is possible to rebuild all of this from scratch, and that is when you see the big visual difference that at least to me, and I think to many other people as well, a lot of Pokemon in Pokemon Sword and Shield do not make. They do not make that big jump in graphics that makes you say, yeah, this looks like a modern console game. Persona 5 does that better. It hasn't been covered in extensive detail, but realistically speaking, let's say that about 2/3 of the 400 character models have had some major rework, whether that be a Galar version of the Pokemon, whether that be actual upgrades to the character models of those Pokemon, making them more detailed, perhaps adding a few more polygons to especially old models, or just really noticeable improvements to the animation that would take a fair amount of time. I think in that sense, both games have a fair amount of comparable workloads when it comes to the amount of character models to work on. But, of course, the workload for the Persona team at Atlas is being much larger because they make everything from scratch. Again, I'm not necessarily against it, but I do think it kind of explains why the visual leap from Ultra Sun, Ultra Moon doesn't seem as noticeable as Persona, and I think this also kind of explains why Pokemon Sword and Shield looks a bit outdated. It doesn't have to be that way. Beyond the actual Pokemons themselves and their detail, I also think it's a valid argument to make that the environments, the way that they are designed, is very different between Pokemon Sword and Shield as well as Persona, or later on, as I will compare it to Ni no Kuni, which is, I suppose, more comparable to Persona in the way that they change up their maps. What you'll see from Persona is that it has a more linear environment, not really an open world section. Rather, it's more so a set of hallways that your character walks through, which allows the developer to add more detail per square inch. This is just a lot more visually pleasing. I'm sure it would be possible to have semi-open worlds that are very detailed. However, most of the Japanese studios do not have a huge budget that would be comparable to, for example, Grand Theft Auto or The Witcher, etc. As well as the general tendency for anime Japanese studios to go for an anime-esque art style. Going for photorealistic details wouldn't really blend very well. Being said, rendering a smaller environment like seen here in Persona 5 does allow the studio to make much more visually pleasing environments with more geometry, also some smaller tricks which helps with the believability of the world. One of the large problems that I personally have with Pokemon Sword and Shield from the demos that I've seen is the draw distance. And I think that many people would agree with me on this one. The way that Pokemon spawn in on the wildlands with the tiny dust effect under them just doesn't look all that good. Here we are back in Pokemon Sword and Shield footage, and I believe it kind of speaks for itself. I think we should excuse the visual quality a little bit. It's rather pixelated because of the YouTube encode. But I believe this kind of proves my point regarding the level of detail issues, the streaming issues, especially in the open world. This is a city, which actually it looks quite nice. Yes, there are some bland pastures here and there, but overall I think that the visual variety found in the smaller villages or cities is perfectly okay. Although honestly, seeing the gameplay footage going into a shop here immediately I think kind of also proves the point, in that the shop looks much more visually pleasing because it is a smaller environment, therefore less geometry is pushed, you have a shorter draw distance, and because of that the amount of detail per square inch, if you were to call it, increases back to the wild area, the wildlands, wild zone, whatever you want to call it. And as you can see, the way that Zatu just spawned in, draw distance just isn't very good. It seems that the draw distance for actual players is much better, much farther, but the way that Pokemon spawn in, I believe that the draw distance in meters wouldn't be much more than 10 or 12 meters, and that is just not enough. Also, the way that they spawn into the environment is not very pleasing to the eye, and I definitely do feel that Game Freak should have had a different animation to cover that up, or they should have made the wild area have more differences in the altitudes of the map layout. That way you can hide the draw distances a bit better through walls, through caves, through any kind of heightened or elevated part of the area, like a hill, to make the draw distance shorter so that you can better hide the way that enemies spawn in. Now in battle everything actually looks perfectly fine here. It's much more traditional, but once again here seeing the wildlands, the wild area, and this is the area with which I have the biggest issue with the graphics of Sword and Shield. I think that this looks much blander than it should have to look. To now loop back into well, the meat of Persona 5 in the shape of one of the actual dungeons found in the game. You can see that Persona 5 really goes out of its way to make those draw distances short, so that geometry can be pumped up, as well as just general detail. I think another thing that makes the graphics really come alive, and I know that this isn't a discussion necessarily about animation, but I do think that this part is interlinked with the graphics, is how Persona 5 handles both its style through its menus as well as action. What you can really see here in this gameplay footage is that during battles everything is hugely animated. A lot of different fonts pop up on your screen, your characters leap up and down, there's a lot of special animations, you actually connect with your opponent, and you get these fancy graphic screens at the end. All of this makes the combat a lot more visceral, a lot more lively, believable as compared to Pokemon. And I get that Pokemon doesn't want to get into the argument of animal abuse, animal fighting. Certainly that is entirely correct. But I believe that these animations combined with the art style of the game, with how 110% the studio went into making everything look like it's moving. Really shows how combat in Pokemon could and perhaps should look. Although, of course, without the bleeding. I think also for the overworld, which this player is about to go back into, you can see that the geometry, the animations, the way that the character runs, the small running, sprinting effects, everything comes together really quite nicely. And I believe that for a fairly large part, that can be thanked to how linear the map is that you as a player progress through. This is not something that is even new to Pokemon, frankly, because the original Pokemon games, even though sometimes you had fairly wide routes in Pokemon Gold and whatnot that offered some form of exploration, they never were open world games. They always were hallway games that would lead you from point A to B, with sometimes hallways being slightly wider, providing the player with some form of exploration by going through different patches of grass, interacting with some other NPCs or perhaps a mini game. But frankly, Pokemon has always been kind of linear. I believe that perhaps was a mistake on Game Freak's part. Once again, I think that the idea of the wild area / wild zone, whatever, is very cool, but I think that the execution is quite weak. I believe that if Pokemon had stuck with its more linear nature, and instead opted to go for higher amounts of polygons per square meter through more linear hallways, kind of like found in Persona here, Pokemon Sword and Shield, would have avoided the graphics debate that it is currently facing. Might have even been less work as compared to an open world, but then again, that will kind of have to be seen once the game actually releases in a few weeks. I don't know how many resets the wild area reuses. I don't know how much different geometry there will be. I don't know if there will be a lot of buildings found in there, or perhaps different biomes, etc. All of those would require a lot of work. Or if it is mostly just the trees and the tiny lakes that we've seen, green patches of grass that turn brown during autumn and whatnot, then perhaps that open world really does primarily just reuse assets and therefore isn't necessarily that much work. Then again, my other argument from earlier applies, where I said that Game Freak should have gone out of their way to make the actual layout of the world more interesting, more diverse, to cover up some of the issues that we are currently seeing, to make sure that Pokemon spawn in more naturally. Why is it that a ghost type like Ghastly spawns in from a gas sand cloud and whatever, from the ground, kind of like a Diglett? It just looks weird. Now, continuing on with Ni no Kuni, this is the original PlayStation 3 version. The gameplay is provided by Gamespot during their demo before the game released, I believe. Now, much like Pokemon, this game is also about familiars which can evolve. So in that sense, it is actually very comparable to the collect 'em all, catch 'em all mantra found in Pokemon. And Ni no Kuni has, from what I've seen, over 300 different familiars, therefore having a larger workload, even a larger amount of character models as compared to Pokemon. Now, I haven't done deep enough research into Ni no Kuni, even though I have played it myself quite extensively, but I haven't looked into the specific numbers. I know for a fact that Ni no Kuni reuses some character models and gives those character models, for example, a different color or whatever to indicate a different elemental affinity. So I do not know to what extent that affects the 300 number of the familiars. I don't know if that is the 300 different models or if that is 300 different familiars, including the reskins. Either way, that is still a very large number of characters to animate. I believe that it could even be argued that it might be a larger workload than found within Pokemon, because Ni no Kuni was obviously made from the ground up. There was no reuse, everything was new. Here, I believe there is something else that we can learn from Ni no Kuni. It has to do with the way that characters are detailed. I think that it's fair to say that Ni no Kuni is a better looking game than most Pokemon games. I do think that Pokemon Sword and Shield has more detail found in its environments, and because of the newer engine, the better hardware and whatnot. However, I think that Ni no Kuni has made some far more interesting and intelligent choices when it came to the aesthetics of the game. Ni no Kuni is very consistent in anime Ghibli-esque art style that it chose for, so that the ground that the player fights on and the backgrounds as well as the models, all of it feels very consistent and natural. And I feel that Pokemon Sword and Shield is one of the games that feels least natural among all of the Pokemon games. I genuinely feel like the older Pokemon games were better at having a consistent art style, which made the graphics more pleasing as a result of that. Besides that, actual character models, as you can see here, are not as detailed as the trainer models found in Pokemon Sword and Shield, and neither are most of the familiars as detailed as Pokemon's found. Often they go for more rounded, simple shapes with only a few layers of clothing, and instead the game developers opted to put a lot of detail into the boss monsters, like the one that just got beaten. There really you can see that they went all out, and I would argue that a fair amount of boss monsters, especially the late game ones, are more detailed than the character models found in Pokemon. And that really is a good thing for Ni no Kuni because it makes them stick out. Now, another thing that I wish to discuss is the way that Ni no Kuni handled its overworld. As you can see from the camera here, the way that the enemies are moving around in chibi forms, not only does it look visually pleasing, but I think that this method of overworld is actually more consistent with what we've seen of the handheld Pokemon games. Especially Pokemon, back when it still used sprites, had that overhead camera that is very comparable to what you see here. So I believe that this, what we're seeing right now, is a much more faithful HD rendition of the Pokemon overworld as compared to something like Pokemon Sword and Shield. Just like Pokemon Sword and Shield, to be honest, the overworld of Ni no Kuni is quite barren. However, what makes it more visually interesting and pleasing is that because it chose for an actual overworld rather than a to-scale world, go from place A to B in a much faster, more visually pleasing way. The developers get to play more with the biomes, because the overworld allows you to travel great distances, even though in reality, of course, everything is just a tiny model, but you get the feeling when you're playing the game that you're traveling a huge distance. You get to go from a forest into a desert, into snowy lands really quickly. And that's just not something that the Pokemon Wild area can do because it is to scale. Here too, I believe that Pokemon could have made a more intelligent decision if they truly felt held back by the hardware as to where it really had to be that barren. They could have gone for a more intelligent design choice like this overworld here, where they can afford to render smaller amounts of things, hide Pokemon between trees like the Ni no Kuni in the background there, as well as the smaller scale player models allow them to have lower detailed models, which you as a player wouldn't even notice because of the zoomed out camera. Alright, here I wanted to still highlight some of the boss gameplay found in Ni no Kuni to prove my point from earlier that they really do go all out with these boss battles and the geometry later on in the game, as you can see here. Everything is really animated, quite highly detailed. They really increase the scale of these bosses, and this really works. This feels extra intimidating because at the start of the game everything is such a small scale with your cute familiars, etc., which have by now of course all been evolved to become stronger versions. This sense of progress is not something that Pokemon has really had. I think that Pokemon Ultra Moon and Sun did a pretty decent job with Ultra Necrozma, which is of course much larger, as well as the Ultra Beasts in general, have a fairly different design philosophy. They don't necessarily look that much like Pokemon, but I think that the difference in scale is more noticeable here as compared to a Pokemon game. As you can see, the boss is now transitioning into its second phase, which is honestly quite... It's a cool mechanic. It's a traditional JRPG mechanic, and I wish that Pokemon would adopt something more similar to it. You could argue that the Elite Four is something similar as you go from battle to battle. I don't believe that the Elite Four ever compared in scale to something like this. Now, what I also wanted to highlight here, I want to remind people that both Persona 5 and Ni no Kuni run on the PlayStation 3. That is older hardware that was notoriously difficult to develop for, and I think that this here, as well as the Persona gameplay from earlier, proves that Sword and Shield can look better on the Switch. The Switch is stronger hardware, it is easier to develop for. Pokemon should have a huge budget in theory, although I hear that is not quite as easy as seems because of all of the different parties involved with the Pokemon brand. In theory, it should be possible for Pokemon games to look as good, as visually pleasing and diverse as what you're seeing here with Ni no Kuni, as what you're seeing in Persona 5 with all of its boss fights. It's possible. Pokemon could look like a modern JRPG, it could look beautiful. It's just that for other reasons they couldn't. Now I want to cap off this video with some of the realistic facts of Game Freak and their limitations. This is one of the more recent trailers of Pokemon Sword and Shield. Honestly, I think that overall actually the game looks kind of okay. It's just that I have some problems with the way that the wild area looks. And I do think that they could have made some smarter choices with their development philosophies. Now, fact of the matter is that Game Freak is a smaller studio. I believe they have about 150 employees. Relatively speaking, compared to Atlas and their Persona team, I believe they have over 200 people easily, or level 5 working on their RPGs like Layton and Ni no Kuni and whatnot. Game Freak is just a smaller studio. Especially something to keep in mind is that not all 150-ish people at Game Freak work on Pokemon Sword and Shield. They always have split teams. While one game is being finished, the other game is already being developed for the next year. And I think that one of the main reasons why this game, why the character models look rather stiff, why the amount of polygons that you can see on screen here, especially for some of the trainer clothing, is rather low. I believe that has to do with the release schedule of Pokemon, to be honest. If you look at the Wikipedia game releases of Pokemon games, usually a Pokemon game releases just about once every year, and sometimes a side game is made by a different studio. I believe that Pokemon Go is made by a different studio than Game Freak. But overall, it's just about an annual release, and that is just not a lot of time to work with. I think that this is proven very much by actually the Call of Duty studios, Activision, Infinity Ward, Sledgehammer, and Treyarch. It used to be that it was just Treyarch and Infinity Ward each other off to release a Call of Duty per year. However, with the demands of modern hardware development, the demands of detail, scale, and whatnot, Activision simply had to add in a third studio, Sledgehammer, to keep that annual gameplay rolling. And I don't think that the studio the size of Game Freak is able to do that right now. 150-ish people is just not enough. And therefore I think that honestly Game Freak made a miscalculation with their ambitions. Do I think that Pokemon Sword and Shield will suck? Not at all. I think that Pokemon Sword and Shield will actually probably be quite good. But I do think that it will feel like a rough transition into the console market. I think that we will find the next Pokemon sequel to look much better, to run better, to have more intelligent design philosophies as compared to Pokemon Sword and Shield right here. Now to end this video, I decided to put in another game that can be compared. I guess it is the original competitor to Pokemon, and that would be Digimon. This game was playable on the PlayStation 4 as well as PlayStation Vita, and I believe that the visuals here in Digimon are often more pleasing than those found in Pokemon Sword and Shield, and I don't think that has to do with detail. I'm pretty confident in saying that Pokemon Sword and Shield actually pushes more detail on screen at once, but Digimon has the advantage in that, again, aesthetically, things feel more consistent. The way that the battle arenas are designed, the effects actually hitting one another a bit better, animations are a bit more ferocious as compared to Pokemon, and that makes everything just feel more consistent. As you can see here, the actual detail of the character models in the overworld is also rather high. It's actually probably even comparable to something like Persona 5, and that is something where Pokemon just falls short in. If you would like me to make more videos in the future, I'm perfectly okay with that. Be sure to hit the like button, and if you can, do comment. As this channel obviously isn't big, I don't expect there to be a lot of comments. And of course, I am very well aware that this video isn't structured as nicely as some of the more experienced professional channels out there. So do forgive me if I'm being a little bit rambly. However, I believe that as I go on, my way of presenting myself should also improve. I hope that I have made my points clear through this video. To recap, I believe that Pokemon Sword and Shield should look better, should animate better on the Switch, but I also believe that given the budget, the amount of studios involved with the Pokemon IP, the annual release schedule and the size of Game Freak, Pokemon can't look better on the Switch as of yet. That will be something that will happen through iteration, through sequels, much like how Generation 7 Sun and Moon looked much more competent as compared to Generation 6's Pokemon X and Y. Thank you for watching, everyone. I'm not intending to be a Pokemon channel, so there can be any kinds of topics related to visuals or art or whatever, animations, or maybe even something like philosophy. If you would like me to talk about that, that's perfectly fine. Thanks for the view, and have a good one.